July 18, 1944. The relentless sun beat down on the Norman bocage, baking the earth and turning the dense hedgerows into formidable claustrophobic fortresses. For the American tankers of the 2nd Armored Division, operating their M4 Sherman medium tanks in this constricted terrain was a daily dance with death, a feeling that every advance was purchased with blood against a German enemy whose heavy Panzers seemed to lurk around every turn, impenetrable and deadly. They believed their superior numbers and their tanks' speed would eventually win the day. But the reality was a brutal grind, a stark imbalance in firepower and protection that chewed through their companies with terrifying regularity. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This narrative will reveal how a desperate, unconventional maneuver, born of sheer necessity and a driver's intuition, would transform the Sherman from a perceived underdog into a formidable, surprising opponent, ultimately rewriting the tactical playbook for armored warfare in the European theater. The frustration was palpable in the summer air, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes, cordite, and fear. Sergeant Michael Mick O'Connell, commander of a Sherman M4A1, designated Spirit of St. Louis, cursed under his breath as yet another report crackled over the intercom. Fox Company just lost 2, sir. Panther ambush near the crossroads. His driver, Private First Class Thomas "Tommy" Jensen, a fresh-faced 19-year-old from Iowa, gripped the steering levers so tightly his knuckles were white. Jesus, Mick, that makes 6 this week for Fox. What are we supposed to do against those cats? The gunner, Corporal James "Dusty" Rhodes, a laconic Texan who usually had a joke for every situation, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the periscope. Their Sherman, like hundreds of others, was equipped with the 75mm M3 gun, a decent weapon against most German armor at shorter ranges, but woefully inadequate when facing the frontal armor of a Panther OSF G, which boasted 80mm of sloped steel on its glacis plate. The Panther's 7.5 Kabuki 42 L70 gun could punch through a Sherman's relatively thin frontal hull, around 51mm to 108mm depending on the variant and angle, with frightening ease, often from distances where the American 75mm rounds simply bounced off or disintegrated harmlessly. The 2nd Armored Division had landed in Normandy with high spirits, confident in their numbers and training, but the reality of combat against the battle-hardened Panzer Lehr Division and other German units had been a brutal awakening. The hedgerows, designed to separate ancient farming plots, had become a perfect defensive terrain for the Germans, limiting visibility and forcing tanks into narrow lanes where they were vulnerable to hidden anti-tank guns or superior German armor lying in wait. Every hedgerow was a potential ambush, every field a kill zone. Lieutenant Davies, their platoon leader, a young West Pointer who tried to project an air of calm he rarely felt, had convened a hurried meeting that morning. "We need to adapt, gentlemen," he'd said, pacing in front of a crude map drawn on a tarp. "Intelligence reports indicate the Germans are concentrating their heavy armor. Panther and Tiger sightings are up. Our 75s just aren't cutting it head-on." The unspoken truth hung heavy. The Shermans were outgunned and out-armored. The crews knew it. They were brave, skilled, and resourceful, but bravery alone couldn't stop an 80mm round from a Tiger Eye or a 7.5mm round from a Panther. Their only advantage seemed to be their speed and numbers, allowing them to flank or overwhelm isolated enemy positions. But in the tight confines of the bocage, flanking was a luxury rarely afforded. The sound of distant artillery fire, a rhythmic thudding that had become the soundtrack to their lives, echoed through the cramped interior of the Spirit of St. Louis. Jensen adjusted his vision block, catching a glimpse of the dust rising from a column of M4A3s from an adjacent company moving up. Their faces were grim, mirroring the sentiment throughout the entire armored contingent. The psychological toll was immense. Every American tanker knew the Sherman had a reputation for brewing up, catching fire due to its gasoline engine and ammunition storage. While later variants and tactical changes would mitigate this, the perception and the grim reality of earlier battles weighed heavily on their minds. They fought with determination, but a quiet desperation began to seep into the ranks. There had to be another way. a way to turn the tables even slightly against an enemy whose machines seemed invincible from the front. Mick O'Connell, a seasoned veteran of North Africa and Sicily, felt the weight of his crew's lives on his shoulders. He was responsible for Jensen, the boyish driver, and Rhodes, the steady gunner, and even for their loader, Private First Class Billy Thompson, a quiet man who rarely spoke but always kept the rounds coming. He knew the stats, he understood the challenge. The average kill ratio was stacked against them. For every Panther or Tiger destroyed, the Americans were losing 3 or even 4 Shermans. This wasn't sustainable. The continuous losses were demoralizing, eroding confidence, and fueling a dangerous fatalism among the crews. They desperately needed a breakthrough, something to tip the scales, even if it seemed impossible in the face of such overwhelming odds. They needed a secret weapon or a new tactic to survive. The heat of the Normandy summer was stifling inside the Sherman. On July 25th, during the opening thrusts of Operation Cobra, O'Connell's platoon was tasked with supporting an infantry advance through a particularly thick patch of bocage near St. Lo. The going was slow, agonizingly slow, and then, without warning, the world exploded. A German 88mm anti-tank gun, cleverly concealed behind a row of ancient oak trees, opened fire. The first round struck the lead Sherman, an M4A3 from Fox Company, directly in the side, tearing through its hull and detonating its ammunition. The tank brewed up instantly, a geyser of flame and black smoke. O'Connell's tank swerved violently to avoid the burning wreck, but another round, likely from a second 88, shrieked past, grazing their turret and sending shrapnel spraying against the hull. The spirit of St. Louis shuddered. "Damage report!" O'Connell yelled, his voice strained. "Left track hit, main gun traverser jammed," Rhodes reported, a note of panic in his voice. "We're exposed, Mick," Jensen shouted, his hands working the controls instinctively. A third round struck the ground just ahead, throwing up a shower of dirt and debris, deafening them inside the cramped compartment. Survival instincts took over. "Tommy, reverse! Get us out of here, fast!" O'Connell bellowed. With their main gun jammed and their mobility compromised, their only option was to retreat. Jensen, adrenaline coursing through his veins, slammed the steering levers into reverse. The Sherman's 15-ton mass lurched backward, its radial engine screaming in protest as it churned through the mud and broken hedgerow. The tank was moving awkwardly, its left track sputtering, but it was moving. Another 88-meter round screamed past, this time over their right side, harmlessly missing. Then, something extraordinary happened. As Jensen backed the Sherman around a corner, its rear armor facing outwards, a German Panther suddenly emerged from a thicket of trees, barely 50 yards away. It had been moving to flank the struggling American tanks. The Panther commander, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, was shocked to see a Sherman backing directly towards him. He expected a fleeing target, not one presenting its rear. The Panther's powerful 7.5 gun traversed. Richter from the Panzer Lehr division aimed for the Sherman's side, a killing shot. But the angle was all wrong. As the Sherman continued its backward retreat, its rear was presented at a surprisingly effective angle. The large blocky engine deck, combined with the transmission housing, offered a more complex target than its flat side. It was not just the 38mm of formal rear armor, but the layers of steel, engine components, and gearboxes that presented a layered defense. The Panther fired. The round struck the Sherman's rear engine deck with a deafening clang, but instead of penetrating, it ricocheted with a screech, sparking brightly off the angled, dense mass of the engine compartment. The crew inside was rattled, but miraculously the round failed to penetrate. "We're hit, but it didn't go through." Thompson, the loader, exclaimed, his voice filled with disbelief. O'Connell, peering through his cupola, watched in astonishment as the Panther's crew, momentarily surprised by the non-penetration, hesitated. Their gunner adjusted. That moment of hesitation was all Rhodes needed. "Mick, traverser's still jammed, but I can elevate. Can we get a shot if we turn slightly?" he yelled. The Sherman, still reversing, swiveled slightly as Jensen made another correction to avoid an obstacle. This brought the Panther into a precarious alignment with the Sherman's still functioning coaxial 30 caliber machine gun. But more importantly, it exposed the Panther's vulnerable side, if only for a second, to a quick, desperate shot. O'Connell quickly assessed the situation. The Panther was closing, its commander shouting orders, clearly regrouping for another shot. The American 75mm gun was stuck, but something else registered. When reversing, Jensen, the driver, had a much clearer view through his rear-facing vision block. He could maneuver with surprising precision, almost like a driver using a rear-view mirror. And the Sherman's profile, when reversing and slightly angled, seemed lower, less exposed. It presented a smaller target. The round that hit them, while terrifying, had not penetrated. It had been absorbed, deflected by the dense layers of machinery and armor at the rear. A thought, audacious and desperate, began to form in O'Connell's mind. This wasn't just a retreat. This was an opportunity. This could be a new way to fight. The perceived weakness, the necessity to retreat, had inadvertently revealed an unexpected strength. The Spirit of St. Louis continued its controlled reverse, its engine sputtering but still pushing. The Panther, regaining its composure, began to maneuver for a flanking shot. But this time O'Connell barked a series of rapid orders. "Tommy, keep reversing, slow and steady, hold that angle. Dusty, traverse manually. Aim for the side of that cat. Thompson, he round, load it fast." Thompson fumbled with an M48 high-explosive round, designed for infantry support, not tank-on-tank combat. "He make it won't pen," he protested. "Just do it," O'Connell snapped. He knew an He round wouldn't penetrate the Panther's armor, but he hoped the blast and fragmentation could damage its tracks or optics, buying them time. As Jensen continued to reverse, keeping the Panther's gun aligned with their own engine block, Dusty Rhodes strained to manually traverse the damaged 75mm gun. He aligned the sights, the Panther filling his periscope. "On target!" he shouted. "Fire!" O'Connell commanded. The Sherman bucked as the He round left the barrel, striking the Panther's side skirts with a concussive blast. Black smoke and debris erupted. It was no killing blow, but it startled the German crew and obscured their vision. "Tommy, hard left reverse, get us behind that burnt-out Sherman!" O'Connell yelled, his plan crystallizing. Jensen expertly maneuvered the damaged tank, using the hulking wreck of their fallen comrade for cover. The Panther, its optics temporarily blinded, fired blindly, the round whistling harmlessly over their position. This momentary respite allowed them to consolidate. Back at the temporary assembly point, Lieutenant Davies, a grim expression on his face, listened to O'Connell's debriefing. "You're telling me, Sergeant, that you engaged a Panther backwards, and it bounced around off your engine?" Davies rubbed his temples, a skeptical frown etched on his face. "Sir, it sounds crazy, I know," O'Connell replied, trying to keep the conviction in his voice. "But Jensen was backing out, and when that Panther hit us, it just rang off the back. I swear, the engine block must have absorbed it, and from Jensen's perspective, he had a clear view of the enemy behind us. He could maneuver better than he could going forward in that tight space." Dusty Rhodes chimed in. "And when we're reversing, we present a smaller frontal silhouette, Lieutenant. All that thick front armor is now essentially rear armor, and the engine's in front, acting as a shield." Davies leaned back, considering this. His platoon had lost 6 tanks in 3 days. He was desperate for anything that offered an edge. "So you're suggesting we drive into battle and backwards?" he asked, a hint of incredulity in his voice. "Not exactly into battle, sir," O'Connell clarified. "More like when we expect to engage a heavy or when we're withdrawing, we back into a fighting position. Our driver, Jensen, noticed the visibility is often better, and it presents a more robust target." The concept was revolutionary, utterly counter to everything they had been taught about tank warfare. The driver, PFC Jensen, was called upon to demonstrate. In an open field behind their lines, he reversed the Spirit of St. Louis with surprising agility, weaving through obstacles. He showed how the rear-facing vision block, positioned high, offered a wider field of view than the forward one, especially in the restricted bocage. He explained that by looking back, he wasn't fighting the tank's natural tendency to present its thickest armor. The other platoon sergeants, and even Captain Miller, their company commander, gathered to observe. Initial reactions ranged from outright laughter to cynical dismissal. Sergeant Davis, a burly veteran from 3rd Platoon, snorted, "You expect me to tell my boys to moon the Krauts with their engine decks? We'll be shot to bits." But Captain Miller, a pragmatic man who valued results above doctrine, saw a flicker of potential. He authorized O'Connell's platoon to test the tactic in a controlled environment. The next day, against a derelict Panzer IV hulk, O'Connell's crew practiced. Jensen reversed the Sherman, presenting its rear. Dusty Rhodes, with Thompson loading, fired a series of 75mm rounds at the Panzer IV's side armor, which was significantly thinner than a Panther's. The results were immediate and positive. Not only did they hit the target reliably, but the maneuver felt less exposed than a frontal advance into a known threat. The first successful engagement using the reverse driving tactic came 2 days later. O'Connell's platoon, ambushed by a lurking Panzer IV, immediately reversed. The Panzer IV, thinking it had an easy shot at a retreating Sherman's side, fired. The round ricocheted off the angled engine deck of a reversing Sherman, just as O'Connell had described. Confused, the Panzer IV crew hesitated. This hesitation cost them. Dusty Rhodes, with a clear view from the periscope, put a high-velocity AP round right through the Panzer IV's turret ring, a killing shot. The German tank exploded. The skepticism began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. This bizarre, unorthodox maneuver, born of desperation, might just be the answer they needed. It was ugly, it was against every instinct, but it worked. Word of O'Connell's backward-fighting Shermans spread like wildfire, at first as a whisper, then as a grudging acknowledgement. It began within Company B of the 66th Armoured Regiment, 2nd Armoured Division, but within weeks, the innovation had crossed company and regimental lines. The initial reports were met with the predictable skepticism from higher echelons. Colonel George S. Patton, a staunch advocate of aggressive, forward-moving tank tactics, would have likely dismissed it as cowardice. However, the grim realities of the hedgerows forced a more pragmatic approach. Captain Miller, O'Connell's company commander, was the first to champion the tactic, providing irrefutable combat reports detailing the increased survivability and, crucially, the rising kill ratios. He presented data that showed the Spirit of St. Louis and 2 other Shermans in O'Connell's platoon had in the span of a week accounted for 3 Panzer IVs and 1 Panther, while sustaining only minor damage. This was an unheard-of success rate against such formidable opposition. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, a battalion commander, took notice. He authorized broader implementation, beginning with the 2nd Armored Division, where the need was most acute. Soon, ad hoc training sessions were being organized in quiet fields behind the lines. PFC Jensen, the unassuming driver, became an unlikely instructor, demonstrating the precise control needed to maneuver a Sherman effectively in reverse. He taught other drivers how to use the high-mounted rear vision block, how to angle the hull to maximize the protection offered by the engine block and transmission, and how to maintain situational awareness while moving in what was traditionally considered a retreat. "It's like you're pulling the tank on a leash rather than pushing it," Jensen would explain, his voice calm amidst the churning engines. "You feel the terrain differently, and you make a smaller target." The core of the tactic involved presenting the Sherman's rear at a slight angle, which maximized the effective thickness of the engine block and the layers of metal and components within. It also made the tank appear smaller and less vulnerable from the German perspective, who were trained to aim for the larger, flatter frontal armor of a Sherman. Moreover, the driver, often the most vulnerable crewman when hit from the front, was now positioned behind the engine block, adding another layer of protection. German confusion at the unorthodox tactic was almost immediate. Early intelligence reports from captured German soldiers and decrypted communications began to filter back to Allied command. Panzer commanders expressed bewilderment at the cowardly yet effective American tactics. Oberleutnant Erich Schmidt, commanding a Panzer IV platoon in the 130th Panzer Regiment, Panzer Lehr Division, wrote in his personal diary on August 5th, "Today, we engaged a forward patrol of American Shermans. Instead of advancing, they began to reverse, presenting their engine decks. My gunner reported a hit on what should have been an easy kill, but the round merely ricocheted. It was absurd. It looked like a retreat, but their return fire was devastatingly accurate. One of my Panzer IVs was knocked out from a side shot as they spun, seemingly without effort." The tactic, derisively nicknamed the backward dance by some German tankers, but quickly earning grudging respect, began to impact German morale. Facing an enemy who fought outside conventional doctrine was unsettling. It broke their tactical rhythm. They were trained to exploit the Sherman's weaknesses, its thin frontal armor, its propensity to burn. But now, the Shermans were presenting their most robust, if unconventional, defense. The statistics on improved kill ratios were compelling. Before the widespread adoption of the backward tactic, American armored units were losing Shermans at a rate of roughly 3-to-1 against Panthers and Tigers in direct engagements. Within a month of O'Connell's innovation spreading, Company B's reports showed a dramatic shift. They were now losing 1 Sherman for every 2 German heavy tanks destroyed, a reversal of fortune that seemed impossible just weeks prior. In some engagements, units employing the tactic exclusively reported even better ratios, approaching 1-1, and in a few instances, exceeding it. This was not a universal panacea. Shermans still fell. But the trend was undeniable. The unexpected strength of the Sherman's rear, coupled with the improved driver visibility and the psychological impact on the Germans, had given the American tankers a vital edge. It was a testament to battlefield adaptation, a gritty ingenuity born of desperation that began to turn the tide in the deadly hedgerow fighting. The bewilderment among German armored forces was palpable. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, commander of a Panther AUSF, G of the 1st Battalion, 130th Panzer Regiment, Panzer Lehr Division, pored over a stack of combat reports in his cramped dugout. His face was etched with fatigue and frustration. His unit, once a proud and dominant force, was now increasingly reporting strange and unsettling encounters. Another one, Oberleutnant Schmidt, Richter sighed, passing a report to his subordinate. Panzer IV 324 engaged a Sherman. The Amerikaner presented its rear, absorbed a direct hit to the engine block, then rotated and destroyed the Panzer IV with a flank shot. This is the 4th such incident this week. Oberleutnant Erich Schmidt, a stern-faced veteran who had fought on the Eastern Front, scowled. "It is a perplexing tactic, Hauptmann. Our training dictates that the Sherman's rear is weak, approximately 38 millimeters. Our 7.5C Scimitar's KWK 42L70 gun should penetrate it with ease. Yet, these reports claim ricochets or non-penetrations." Richter tapped the report with a gloved finger. "Yes, but they are presenting it at an angle, and the engine itself provides additional shielding. It's not just the plate armor. It's the engine block, the transmission, the gearboxes. These absorb the impact or cause deflections, and the driver is better protected." He then pulled out his personal diary, its pages filled with his neat, angular script. A recent entry read, "August 9th, 1944. The Amerikaner tanks are fighting like frightened animals, yet with a perverse cunning. They expose their weakest point, their rear, but somehow turn it into a strength. My gunner, Feldwebel Becker, swore he had a perfect shot on a retreating Sherman's engine deck yesterday. The shell struck, but merely sparked off. Moments later, that same Sherman, seemingly retreating, spun on its axis and put a round through the flank of our accompanying Panzer Grenadier half-track. This is not how tanks are meant to fight. It violates all doctrine. It is maddening." The German High Command, initially dismissing the reports as isolated incidents or errors in judgment by their crews, began to take notice as the frequency increased. Analysts studied fragments of American combat reports captured from fallen soldiers, finding references to reverse engagements and rear-facing advances. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, issued a directive requesting immediate tactical adjustments to counter this new American trickery. Suggested countermeasures included concentrated fire on the reversing tanks' tracks to immobilize them, or utilizing combined arms tactics, infantry with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks to engage the vulnerable sides of the Shermans once they committed to the backward maneuver. However, the bocage terrain, which had initially favored the German defense, now complicated their response. Flanking maneuvers were slow and exposed infantry to American artillery and machine gun fire. The psychological impact on the German tank crews was significant. Their training emphasized the superiority of their Panthers and Tigers. They were taught that the Sherman was an inferior tank, easily dispatched. To see these inferior machines adopt such an unconventional and worse effective tactic eroded their confidence. It sowed seeds of doubt. Instead of simply engaging a retreating Sherman, they now had to consider the possibility that the retreat was a deliberate tactical ploy designed to lure them into a specific engagement profile. This added a layer of hesitation and uncertainty to their combat decisions. "They are no longer fighting by the book, Erich," Richter stated, his voice heavy. "They are improvising, and that makes them dangerous. Our rigid adherence to doctrine, while powerful, makes us predictable. Their chaos is their strength." He rose, pacing the confined space. "We must adapt. We must instruct our gunners to ignore the engine deck if they are reversing at an angle. Focus on the tracks or wait for the lateral rotation that exposes the side. But even that is a risk. They are faster than our Panthers and can pivot quickly." A new set of instructions was hastily disseminated throughout the Panzer Lehr division and other units facing the Americans. These instructions, detailing how to counter the backward Shermans, were a clear admission that the American tactic was having a significant, disruptive effect. The enemy, once seen as simply numerous but tactically predictable, was proving to be surprisingly adaptable, and this adaptability was costing the Wehrmacht dearly in men and machines. The game had changed, and the Germans, despite their superior tanks, found themselves forced onto the defensive, struggling to respond to an innovation they never anticipated. The largest test of the reverse tactic came in early August, during the relentless Allied push eastward following the St. Lo breakout. Operation Lüttich, the German counteroffensive towards Mortain, involved a significant concentration of German armor, including elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The American 3rd Armored Division, alongside elements of the 2nd Armored, found itself in a series of brutal large-scale engagements. On August 7th, near the town of Frommenthal, a spearhead of 24 Panthers and Panzer IVs from Das Reich launched a furious assault aimed at breaking through American lines. The air was thick with the roar of engines, the concussive blasts of artillery, and the frantic chatter of radio communications. Sergeant O'Connell, his Spirit of St. Louis now sporting a few more scars, was positioned with his platoon at a critical defensive choke point. They had spent the previous night preparing, digging in their tanks, and positioning infantry support. As the German spearhead emerged from the morning mist, the battle was joined. "Panthers! Straight ahead, multiple contacts!" Dusty Rhodes shouted, his voice steady despite the overwhelming sight. "Tommy, get ready. We're doing the dance," O'Connell commanded. Instead of rolling forward to meet the enemy head-on, O'Connell's platoon, along with 2 other companies that had fully adopted the reverse tactics, immediately began to back up, angling their Shermans to present their engine decks. The German panzer crews, expecting a conventional engagement, were momentarily thrown off. Hauptmann Richter, leading a Panther company, watched in disbelief as the American tanks began to reverse. "They are fleeing. Pursue with speed," he ordered. But then he saw something unusual. The American tanks weren't simply turning tail and running. They were backing into prepared positions, using the terrain to their advantage, and presenting a surprisingly resilient target. The first volley from the German Panthers was met with a chorus of metallic clangers and ricochets as their powerful 7.5mm rounds struck the angled rear armor of the reversing Shermans. The effect was astonishing. Instead of instant penetrations, the rounds were skipping off, deflecting, or being absorbed by the dense machinery within. O'Connell's Spirit of St. Louis took a direct hit to its engine deck from a Panzer IV. The impact rattled the crew, but the round incredibly failed to penetrate. "No penetration, no penetration," Thompson yelled, his voice a mix of fear and elation. "Return fire, Dusty. Target that Panzer IV's flank," O'Connell shouted. As the German tanks pressed their attack, the American Shermans performed their backward dance with practiced precision. Jensen, and drivers like him across the battlefield, became masters of this unorthodox maneuver. They would reverse, presenting their rear, absorb incoming fire, then quickly pivot, exposing their side for a swift, accurate shot from their 75mm or 76mm guns Some units by this time had received the M4A376W variant. The effectiveness of this tactic was magnified by the sheer number of American tanks employing it. Where individual Shermans were still vulnerable, a concentrated line of backward fighting tanks presented a bewildering and deadly challenge to the Germans. Over 2 hours of intense fighting, the landscape around Fromental became a graveyard of twisted steel. The German attack, initially potent, began to falter. The morale of the German Panzer crews, already strained by the strange American tactics, began to crack under the sustained, unexpected resistance. Richter's Panther Company found itself bogged down, struggling to find a weakness in the retreating American armor. His gunner reported repeated ricochets. Then, as a Sherman from O'Connell's company performed a rapid pivot, it exposed its side armor to a lurking Panzerfaust team, but then, in a blink, the Sherman's gun fired. The round slammed into the side of Richter's Panther, right into the vulnerable area above the tracks. The Panther shuddered, smoke began to billow from its engine compartment, and a groan of metal announced its impending doom. Richter ordered his crew to abandon the tank, barely escaping the inferno. The turning point was evident. The backward dance had transformed the battlefield dynamics. American combat reports from that day painted a clear picture. The kill ratio, which had long favored the Germans, had dramatically shifted. For every American Sherman lost, 2, sometimes even 3, German Panthers and Panzer IVs were destroyed. The psychological advantage had swung to the Americans. The Germans, expecting an easy kill against the retreating Shermans, found themselves facing a resilient, elusive foe that turned conventional tank warfare on its head. The sound of exploding German tanks and the sight of their retreating infantry signaled a decisive victory for the Americans, a victory largely attributed to the ingenuity of a few tank crews and their unconventional tactic. The German response was swift and brutal, albeit often predictable. Having been caught off guard by the American backward dance, German commanders began to implement countermeasures. Oberleutnant Erich Schmidt, now commanding a company of Panther OSF G tanks, focused his efforts on targeting the tracks of the reversing Shermans. "A hit to the track will immobilize them, regardless of their cunning," he instructed his gunners, his voice cold and determined. "Then we can flank them at our leisure." Artillery concentrations were also adjusted, with heavier barrages directed at areas where American tanks were known to employ the tactic, aiming to disrupt their formations and force them into less defensible positions. Infantry armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks were increasingly deployed in ambush positions within the hedgerows, specifically tasked with hitting the vulnerable side and turret armor of Shermans as they maneuvered. These countermeasures, though often crude, began to inflict new losses on the American tankers. The initial euphoria of the backward dance began to be tempered by the harsh realities of an adapting enemy. On August 15th, during a brutal engagement near Argentan, O'Connell's platoon found itself in dire straits. Advancing into an orchard, they were met with a storm of anti-tank fire, a carefully concealed 7.5mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, its crew expertly hidden, opened fire on their flank. The lead Sherman from O'Connell's company, an M4A376W, took a direct hit to its side armor. It brewed up instantly, the high-velocity round piercing through its thinner side plate. "Tommy, reverse, get us out!" O'Connell yelled, but as Jensen began to execute the maneuver, a second PaK-40, cleverly positioned, put a round directly into the right track of the Spirit of St. Louis. The track snapped with a deafening screech of rending metal, sending the Sherman skidding to a halt. They were immobilized, exposed. "Damn it!" O'Connell cursed, scanning the periscope frantically. "We're stuck!" Dusty Rhodes frantically tried to acquire the PaK-40's position, but the camouflaged gun was almost invisible. Thompson, the loader, nervously chambered another round, sweat beading on his forehead. This was the crisis point. The Germans had learned. They weren't just blindly shooting at the engine deck anymore. Doubt crept into the ranks. Had their brilliant tactic been fully countered? Were they just back to being vulnerable targets? The human cost of this brutal adaptation was evident in the faces of the American crews. Letters home spoke of constant vigilance, of the unending tension. Sergeant O'Connell wrote to his wife, "The Krauts are learning our tricks. Every day is a new challenge. We gain an inch, they find a way to take it back. Sometimes I wonder if this war will ever end, or if we'll just keep trading blows until there's nothing left. A combat report from Captain Miller detailed the evolving struggle. The effectiveness of the reverse maneuver is undeniable. But the enemy has begun to adjust their tactics. We are seeing more focused attacks on our tracks and better concealed anti-tank guns targeting flanks during maneuvers. Our crews are now training to rapidly shift from reverse engagement to forward movement, employing smoke screens, and coordinating more closely with supporting infantry to suppress anti-tank teams. The battlefield is a constant chess match, and every move carries a heavy price. Despite the new challenges, the core ingenuity of the reverse tactic proved resilient. American tankers, not content to be outmaneuvered, began to adapt further. Innovation under fire became the new norm. Crews started carrying additional track sections and tools, practicing rapid track repairs under simulated combat conditions. Some units experimented with attaching spare track links or sandbags to the side armor, providing an extra layer of protection against Panzerfausts, though this was of limited effectiveness. Others developed tactics combining the reverse maneuver with quick, aggressive flanking bursts, using the element of surprise to engage German armor from angles they didn't expect. The moment of doubt, the period of intensified losses, forced them to refine their approach. It was no longer simply about driving backward. It was about integrating this tactic into a broader, more flexible combat doctrine. O'Connell's crew, despite being immobilized, managed to survive that day. With the help of supporting infantry who suppressed the PaK-40s and a daring recovery by an M32 tank recovery vehicle, the spirit of St. Louis was eventually pulled back. The experience, however, served as a stark reminder. Innovation was a constant arms race, but the fundamental shift in tank combat, initiated by a simple reversal, had proven its worth. It bought them time, it saved lives, and it fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of tank warfare in the West. It wasn't about one trick, it was about the spirit of adaptation. The echoes of the war faded, replaced by the somber quiet of post-war analysis. The tactical innovations of World War II became subjects of intense study, none perhaps as unconventional or impactful as the American backward dance. In the aftermath, military historians and tacticians pored over combat reports, interviewed surviving crew members, and dissected the effectiveness of every new strategy. A declassified U.S. Army Ordnance Corps report titled Analysis of M4 Sherman Combat Effectiveness in Northwest Europe, published in 1947, dedicated a significant section to what it termed reverse engagement tactics. The report highlighted specific instances where this unorthodox method dramatically improved survivability and kill ratios. It noted, the M4 Sherman's engine compartment, while formerly rated at 38 mm of rear armor, consistently demonstrated an effective resistance equivalent to significantly thicker frontal plates when presented at an angle. The layers of the Ford GAA engine block, transmission, and associated components absorbed or deflected incoming high-velocity rounds that would otherwise have perforated thinner areas. This, combined with the improved driver's visibility and the psychological disorientation of the enemy, proved to be a critical battlefield adaptation. The report concluded with a stunning statistic. While early war engagements saw German heavy armor, Panther, Tiger, outperforming the M4 Sherman with an average kill ratio of 3:1 or even 4:1 in their favor, units extensively employing reverse engagement tactics consistently achieved ratios approaching 1:1, and in numerous documented cases surpassed it, ultimately contributing to a total German tank destruction rate that was nearly double what would have been achieved had conventional tactics been strictly adhered to. The spirit of St. Louis and its crew, Sergeant Michael O'Connell, Private First Class Thomas Jensen, Corporal James Rhodes, and Private First Class Billy Thompson, were cited in several commendations. Their innovative thinking recognized as a decisive factor in specific engagements. Jensen, in particular, was lauded for his exceptional driving skills and for effectively seeing what others had missed in the chaos of battle. His intuition about the engine block's protective qualities proved to be prescient. The historical impact of this tactic was profound, though often understated in public narratives. It underscored a fundamental difference between American adaptability and German rigidity. The Germans, with their technically superior tanks and deeply ingrained doctrine, struggled to adapt to an opponent who actively defied established rules of engagement. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, after his capture and subsequent interrogation, reflected on the experience. "We were taught to respect the Panzertrupper's doctrine, to exploit the known weaknesses of enemy armor. When the Americans began fighting in reverse, it was deeply unsettling. It was illogical. We spent weeks trying to understand and counter it, rather than simply adapting our own fundamental approach. They were thinking outside the box, and we were trapped within it. While the backward dance did not fundamentally alter tank design, future tanks would focus on all-around protection and improved firepower, it profoundly influenced tactical training. The importance of driver training in all aspects of maneuver, the strategic use of terrain, and the psychological impact of unconventional tactics became central tenets of post-war armored warfare doctrine. It highlighted that even an ostensibly inferior weapon, when wielded with ingenuity and flexibility, could overcome superior technology. Years later, at a reunion of the 2nd Armored Division, Thomas Jensen, now an old man with a twinkle in his eye, reminisced about those desperate days. "We just wanted to stay alive, you know. Nobody went to war wanting to be a hero. We just figured out a way to turn our weakness into something else. The Sherman wasn't pretty, and it sure wasn't a Panther, but it was ours, and we learned to make it dance." His words captured the essence of the American war effort in that theater, a pragmatic, innovative spirit that found solutions in the most unlikely of places. The Shermans, often maligned, became a testament not just to industrial might, but to the ingenuity and sheer will of the crews who fought them, proving that the greatest weapon on the battlefield was often not steel or firepower, but the human mind's capacity for adaptation. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.